I suppose the impression I have from afar is that if it had not been for COVID, two-part question really, if COVID hadn't happened, my guess is that Trump would have been returned as your president. Perhaps even if COVID had happened and he had handled it differently, the result might have been the same. So am I jumping too far to say that COVID's had a profound effect on America politically?
COVID and Donald Trump cost Donald Trump the election. If COVID hadn't happened and we had continued economic growth in the high 2%, 2.7, 2.8, even if it dropped 2.4, above 2% a year GDP growth, coupled with, and this is what it was exceptional about the economic growth that we were experiencing up until 6 months ago now, coupled with the sharpest drop in the poverty level in half a century, African Americans and Hispanics were enjoying the lowest unemployment level ever recorded. So what you got was, for the first time in decades, an economic expansion that directly benefited ordinary working people and even disadvantaged minorities, just unquestionably, in a way that they could feel and experience and that we could all see. COVID just stopped that. It just stopped it. And then Donald Trump, honestly, in my opinion, well, again, you're a professional, you'd have to tell me what you think, but he didn't help himself. We know in this much, people will be studying the results of this election for weeks to come, for years to come, for that matter. But we now know that Donald Trump, he gained in a number of areas. He gained among Hispanics, and he gained not a great deal, but he gained some in the black vote. He gained among Asians. This is dramatic for a Republican president to pick up minority votes, but he lost the older voters. And it seems quite clear that older people were frightened, just scared of COVID, and he failed to reassure them. If you tick down the policies, it's really very hard. You draw a chart. Here's what we knew. Here's what we learned. Here's what Trump did. We learned this. He responded this way. The policies were perfectly reasonable and in a number of ways very impressive. This so-called Operation Warp Speed. Now we're going to get vaccines. It looks, we just read this morning that Pfizer is applying to the FDA for approval of its vaccine next week. A vaccine in a period of months, not years, that's just exceptional. And Trump and his administration played a role in that. But the policies are one thing, and the way he spoke and his demeanor and the way he clearly didn't want to wear a mask, and all of that unnerved people. In my judgment, in some ways, his fundamental instinct that the health experts were pushing the country to lock down too hard, the instinct to question that was almost certainly correct. But he unnerved people, frightened people, failed to reassure people. He failed to act, I hate to use the term because it's so cliche, but you'll know what I mean. He failed to act in a presidential way. And he that's one place where he lost ground. In Arizona, for sure, it seems to have cost him a state in Arizona. It may have cost him several other states that you could name. So yes, absent COVID, the man who would be getting ready to take the oath of office in January would be Donald Trump instead of Joe Biden.
It's an interesting thing to contemplate, though, that as I look at it, I mean, I was always deeply concerned about his apparent reluctance as I looked on from an outsider. And I want to be careful here. It's not for me to be gratuitously commenting too much, although our media do it all the time, on your affairs. But what happens in America is very important to the rest of the world, and especially to Australia. That reluctance to reach out to the enemies and try and build the bridges and friendships. Now, I can understand the hypocrisy of many of his critics who say that he was ruining democracy. Well, democracy's not been ruined in America. The system and the people are more robust and above that. As I said, it's not broken. But it does seem to me that there are two enormous problems arising. One is that his opponents now are dancing on his grave in a way that must make it very difficult to know how to rebuild. They don't seem interested themselves in doing what they accused him of never doing, which is reaching out and building bridges. The president-elect has made some good noises, but it's not what you're getting from his broader opponentry, if I can put it that way. And the second thing is that the hard questions about why so many American people were very reluctant to embrace the Democratic platform is not being argued.
Exactly.
I mean, what is it? It's just not good enough to say 72 or 73 million of my fellow country people, I suppose that's the way to put it, still chose, after all that, to run with President Trump. Why? How can a democracy work if that question is not asked in good faith? Here are my fellow Americans. They have a different view despite everything. What are they saying? Why do they feel distrustful and dispossessed? How do we rebuild? Because disunity is death.
Yes, I agree completely. It is impossible. I mean, just flatly impossible, in my judgment, to read this election as a repudiation of Donald Trump. He did better than any of the polls. There were a couple of polls that got it about right, but he did better than the polls and the mainstream media expected. And this is the critical point. He got close to 9 million more votes this time than he did last time around. Of course, Joe Biden outpolled Hillary Clinton by something like 11 million votes. We had an enormous increase in participation, but you can't say that the country repudiated Donald Trump. That's exactly right. There are something like 70 million people who voted for him. To my mind, it's almost the way that the people who accuse Trump of defying norms or endangering democracy themselves did so. The kind of precision with which they were guilty of their own accusations is just amazing. So there's a long theme there. We could talk about that alone for hours, but let me just say the press. Most of the press, overwhelmingly the press, with only a couple of exceptions, and the honorable exceptions would be those by your fellow, the media outlets founded or owned by your fellow Australians, the Murdochs, the Wall Street Journal in particular, and Fox News, of course, and the New York Post. Aside from really those three outlets, aside from those and some outlets online, the incuriosity of the mainstream media, the failure to attempt to understand why roughly half the country, just as you put it, why roughly half the country insisted on voting for Donald Trump is just astounding, as is the failure to ask questions of health officials of exactly the kind that you outlined. The way the press has become partisan isn't quite, they're not partisan in the sense that they favor the Democratic Party. It's almost, it's worse than that. They've become, even great newspapers and even highly educated, very intellectually refined reporters are now producing ham-fisted propaganda. I don't see any other way to put it than that.
It's extremely dangerous, as I see it. I can only say that it really worries me because it's a Western-wide problem. It really is. And part of the response to it, of course, is precisely what you and I are doing now. People everywhere are going offline, so to speak, and more and more people are getting their news services and their information outside the mainstream, and yet mainstream doesn't seem to be learning the lessons. They could draw people back with high quality, objective, fair analysis. I genuinely believe that.
I think there's no doubt. By the way, I have to be careful, John. I don't want to take back. I want to amend something I said a moment ago, that Donald Trump cost himself the election. Everything I said, I believe to be true. At the same time, though, I believe one reason, I don't know that I could say it's the leading reason, but it may be one reason people supported him with such energy that he got 9 million more votes this time around than last time around is because he talked back. Donald Trump talked back. He talked back to the media. He talked back to the universities. And people forgave him a great deal because there he was saying things that ordinary people felt and were not in a position to say. In some ways, it took a vulgar, loudmouth billionaire, only somebody of that character and in that position could talk back. People forgave him a lot because he was saying things that were on many ordinary Americans' minds. This that he lost, and that in many ways he cost himself the election. On the other side in this country, there's great joy. People are dancing on his grave, as you said, on his political grave. I view the whole thing as tragic, because up until 6 months ago, what do those figures mean? That African Americans and Hispanics had the lowest unemployment rates ever recorded. It means that millions of people who are in underprivileged positions, who start out in the more difficult positions in American society, were leading better lives. They were able to act on their aspirations, and that loudmouth New Yorker standing up to the liberal or progressive media consensus, that man was responsible for enabling millions of Americans to lead better lives. And now it has all collapsed. And that, to me, it's tragic. What we've just experienced in tragedy.
Thank you for watching this episode. We appreciate your support. If you value vital conversations like this one, be sure to subscribe to the channel there, and also click the notification bell to stay up to date with new releases.